living in New Haven and in New York City. I have two places, and it's kind of a long journey because I was born in Australia, and I lived in London when I was 11 and 12, and then I came to America to study when I was 19. So there's sort of a long story there. Basically, I started with quite an artistic mother, and my father was an economist, and they took us to a lot of concerts when we were young, and gave me piano lessons when I was starting at the age of 7. And I was studying with a wonderful woman who had a very broad range of repertoire then, although I didn't do much contemporary music. I was doing basically standard literature. When I went to London to study with a woman there, Kathleen Crease, she gave me sort of very interesting editions and proper French Durand editions and things like that. And also music by Matthias Seiber, who was a Hungarian composer who lived in London, who'd come in during the war, and so volumes of music that was written by a living composer at that time. But they were all fun things like blues and tangos for four hands and stuff like that. They were quite fun. A little bit Bartokian, sort of dance-like pieces. And then when I went back to Australia after 2 years in London, my father had been posted there. I studied with another teacher, and I didn't really concentrate very much on music. I wasn't practicing very hard. I was playing violin and piano and in the choir, and I was doing acting and visual art classes, a sort of like a diverse artistic range of things. But when I started to think seriously about how I was going to finish school and what I was going to do after school, I realized that music was probably the thing that I did best out of all of those artistic things. And I felt also that there was more of a known path forward. So when I auditioned for the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, I'd already been living in Sydney for 2 years studying with a Russian Jewish teacher by the name of Albert Lander. And he was telling me, if you practiced, you could be really good. So I went through periods of time where I really started to practice hard. And lo and be told, my technique got a lot better, and I started to say, okay, so I think I want to do music. I want to do piano. So I started the Sydney Conservatorium of Music and a Bachelor of Music degree in 1978. And the very first people that I was sitting next to in classes were composers, and they were asking me if I wanted to fill in and play their piece in a concert. And so rather than just playing concert practice and recitals and juries, I was also playing in new music recitals that were separate from the conservatorium, and they were sometimes public concerts, sometimes they were in-house concerts, but they were always sort of much more fun than the standard, Bach Prelude and Fugue, Beethoven Sonata, Liszt Etude, and a Debussy piece, which was sort of the standard recital you would hear in those days. So I was very attracted to new music. It turned out I was quite good at it. I learned things quickly. I was very influenced by a professor at school, a man by the name of Richard Toop, who has passed away since then, who was our musicology teacher, and he had been the pianist for Stockhausen in the 50s and 60s. So he had just emigrated to Australia, and so he was telling us all the time in the cafeteria about new music and what was the latest thing happening, and his lectures were really exciting. They were very broad and diverse, talking about high modernism and experimental music and new music of all kinds. We do Stockhausen, John Cage, Steve Reich, Philip Glass, all these people, and he would give us a lot of interesting background and play these amazing tapes, So I was like really turned on by that. And I think possibly, I'd been a bit of a rebel as a child. I didn't want to go down that straight path of just conservative traditional music. Partly because I didn't feel like I fit in with those people, because my training had been so diverse. I hadn't gone to a conservatory. I hadn't studied with the same teacher the whole time. I had traveled across the world, and so I was not, within a stable kind of background for going into competitions, and I hadn't gone into competitions. So it was a little bit, seemed right for me to kind of veer in the direction of new music. And so I did, and I studied old and new, because obviously in order to get your bachelor's and your master's and your doctorate, you have to do traditional music as well. And I really enjoyed traditional music. I didn't like the tyranny of memorizing things. After a while, I thought, well, I like new music because you don't have to memorize it, and then I can do more things, because when you have to memorize something, you have to limit the amount that you can do. So I was very, that was even more attractive to me, that aspect of it. Working with composers was fantastic. It was like making a tradition that you have from scratch. You've got a piece. No one has ever seen the piece of music before. You're the first person, so I can lay down the tradition. I can ask the composer, what do you want here? I can negotiate with the composer. I can edit with him and say this part doesn't quite work with the hands. So there's many things that I found very exciting, not to mention the fact that I got gigs from it too. So at a very young age, I was getting reviewed while I was a student by the Sydney Morning Herald for doing a premiere of a piece. So that was very exciting. It was like a living, breathing tradition. And I felt also that I was connected to the older world, which used to be that way too. It's only really since the record player and the phonograph LPs, the recorded music, that we got stuck in playing old music. And it's a good stuck, because the music is fantastic. But it was also not, it meant that pianists just kind of would just specialize in that area and not broaden their scope, which is so important, because we have this huge repertoire. It's as big as the Russian literature and the English literature. If you think of all the books in the libraries, piano literature is on a par with that. There's no life that could possibly play every piece that's been written for the piano. And so anyway, while I was doing my Bachelor of Music, I got asked to play a piece by a visiting professor from the University of Illinois. And I premiered that, I gave the Sydney premiere of a piano piece of his. And he asked me he said, oh, you should go and study at the Juilliard School in New York. And I was like, wow, what's that? And I was quite naive about things like that. And so I said, oh, no, I couldn't go to New York. I mean, that would be just too scary. I didn't like the competitive edge to making music. I'm a competitive person, but I'm not competitive in terms of playing music. I always felt like competitions, as Bartók said, piano competitions are for horses. So I always felt a little bit that was not something that I wanted to do. That each person is different, and to put them in a competition situation is marking them for certain attributes and aggregates and that sort of thing. I have done some competitions, but I can't say that I enjoyed them. I decided to apply to the University of Illinois, where I knew this composer, where I knew somebody, because I didn't know anybody in the United States, but I'd always wanted to go to America. And after we had gone to England when I was a teenager or early teen, I was fascinated by, American 60s culture and pop music and movies and things like that. And I thought, wow, that sounds such a great place to go. I really want to go to the United States. So I applied and I transferred. I got in and I transferred my junior year and ended up going into the University of Illinois and transferring all my credits. And immediately I was accepted into the contemporary music ensemble, which I had never played in. I'd never done anything more than a trio at that point. And I hadn't worked with a conductor before, except I had played celeste and stuff in the orchestra and in choir. I'd sung in choir. So, but I hadn't been in an intimate group of 6, 7, 8 people playing new music together. So that was fantastic. And University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana had about 100 composers that were studying. They used to take about 30 a year. So you can imagine the Bachelor of Music program was filled with composers. And the other pianists didn't want to play. There was no competition. They didn't want to play any new music. I had a wonderful piano teacher, William Hylas, who played Donald Martino's Pianissimo and Boulez's Third Sonata, and he was very open to doing new music. So I did my classical requirements, and I was playing in all of the contemporary ensemble concerts. And there was a wonderful conductor called Paul Zahn, who was an amazing guy, very friendly, very good conductor. So I had a wonderful experience of having a good conductor. And I ended up, while I was in my Bachelor of Music, I entered a competition in New York called the International American Music Competition. And I came second in the competition, and it was amazing. In fact, Randall Hodgkinson came first, I came second, and Stephen Drury came third. And I was only 21. That was a big boost for me, and I got invited to Tanglewood, and I didn't go, but I was, I met all those guys in New York and had a really good feeling about New York at that time. I kept going with my bachelor's, and then I went to Paris and studied with Yvonne Loriod for a year. And that was very interesting. And mainly we did actually traditional music, because she had a lot of substitute fingerings for small hands and a lot of tricks that she used to do. So that was cool. She wasn't particularly into new music, actually. I mean, we did some Messiaen together. She was married to Messiaen. But we didn't do much new music. And I really wanted to do technique, so I did a lot of Chopin etudes with her and things. And then after a year in Paris, I decided I wanted to get back to America because I missed it a lot. And so I had already applied to Eastman. I went to Eastman and studied with David Burge. And during that period of time, I got actually really sick. And I ended up having to go back to Australia. I got cancer. I got Hodgkin's disease. And I went back to Australia for 6 months. And during that 6 months, I was on chemotherapy, but I practiced really, really hard again, and I was really working very seriously. And I decided that this was what I really did want to do, was to go back. And because when you get sick, you really confront a lot of fears about, a lot of inner thoughts about, am I sick because I'm not happy? Am I sick because, what's going on here? There's a lot of people try to give you advice when you're sick, right? Oh, just do this, just drink that, just have that, just do yoga, just, So you're trying everything, right? Anyway, I ended up going back and finishing at Eastman. And then I decided I wanted to move to New York because I had gone, I went to Tanglewood in between. So that was summer 85. And I met Gil Kalish, who I absolutely loved. And he introduced me to a lot of people at Tanglewood. And I had worked already with Jan de Gaetani at Eastman, and Gil was her accompanist. And she was a fantastic mezzo-soprano who died way too soon of leukemia. And she had sung all of George Crumb's works, or George Crumb had written all the works for her. And incidentally, David Burge, my teacher at Eastman, George Crumb had written a lot of his works for him. And so I was there were a lot of composers at Eastman. There was a fantastic new music ensemble, which I played in, conducted by Sidney Hodgkinson. And Sid it was very competitive trying to play in that group at Eastman, unlike Illinois. And so I played in a lot of Musica Nova concerts, and then I decided to move to New York because most of the people I met at Tanglewood were going to move to New York or had lived in New York, and I decided I didn't want to go back to Europe, I was too soon to go back to Australia. So I went to New York and I started studying with Gilbert Kalish privately, and I started freelancing right away. And I joined a group called Terra Australis, which was a group that we did contemporary Australian works because it was our bicentennial year that year. And I hooked up with a bunch of musicians, basically from Tanglewood. But after a year of studying with Gil, only very occasionally because he was very busy, I decided I needed to go to Stony Brook and study with him full time. So I went to Stony Brook, and that, of course, has a wonderful tradition of new music. Had Ray DeRoche and was running the percussion ensemble, and there was a lot of new music concerts. And so I did my doctorate out there while I was living in New York. And while I was living in New York, I got involved with Bang on a Can, and that was I was very lucky to get asked to join their ensemble that they were just forming at that time. So I had played in a couple of Bang on a Can early festivals in the late 80s. And then we did our first Bang on a Can All-Stars concert, I believe, in 1992. And we sort of went straight to the top. We played at Lincoln Center. We played in South Bank in England. We played festivals across Europe. And we were helped by Louis Andriessen and Philip Glass and Steve Reich, who were at that time really at their peak. They were sort of 60-something, and they were getting a lot of festival directorships and curating opportunities. So they would invite the Bang on a Can All-Stars to come and play at their festivals. Bang on a Can is a wonderful organization. If you don't know it, you should check it out on the web. They're run by 3 composers, David Lang, Michael Gordon, and Julia Wolfe. And they wanted their music played in New York, so they decided to run a festival and put their own music on it, and also start an ensemble which would play their music plus the music of others. So we would play a lot of Lang, Gordon, and Wolfe, and we would also do Reich, Glass, Andriessen, Bresnik, Rzewski, Cage, and as well as that, a new young group of composers that were coming up. A lot of women composers, a lot of BIPOC composers, and so we were sort of at the cutting edge of that whole change of awareness and of genre and diversity. It was very exciting. We would sometimes do the music with a rock musician who didn't write music himself, that he would just teach us orally how to play the stuff, and then we would do shows with them. We worked with Cecil Taylor, with Ornette Coleman, Sonic Youth's Thurston Moore. We did some really amazing projects, and I'd have to improvise. So we have to learn to improvise, which is a wonderful skill for all musicians, I think. And the same, all while this is going on, I was starting to record. So I did some records with an Australian label called Tall Poppies, and by now I have about 10 or 11 solo discs and EPs, and about 30 or 40 ensemble discs as well, collaborative discs with people and groups, different groups. So I've basically been freelancing in New York since 1985, really. Bang on a Can started in 1992, and I left Bang on a Can in 2008 after 16 years because I was tired of being on the road a lot, and being on the road for other people's projects. I decided more to develop my own projects, and that wasn't a very stable schedule. So it was difficult to teach. It was difficult to have to say yes to other groups. It was, even though Bang on a Can was wonderful, it wasn't really full time. It was more like you'd be away for sort of 2 weeks and then back for 1 week. Then you might go away for another week, and then you'd be back for 5 weeks, and then you'd go out for a weekend thing, and then you would, So it was not a regular group. You couldn't rely on it financially to give you an annual salary at the same time as it was fantastic. I mean, and they really broke a lot of traditions and opened up the whole new music scene for wonderful opportunities for young composers and also for young musicians. So they have a festival every year at Mass Mocha in North Adams, Massachusetts, called the Bang on a Can Summer Institute, and people can apply to perform on that. It's like a 3-week hard working 3 weeks for all the musicians, and you perform the composers that have been invited to come, and you're very, very, very busy, but there's all sorts of other opportunities to do there besides written music. You get to play pieces like Terry Riley's In C, which is always fun to do, and ensemble pieces for mixed ensemble that are not necessarily fixed.
You're living with a composer, and
Yes.
you've worked with hundreds of composers. Now, how does that look like in terms of playing their music and working together? And to, of course, lots of times it premieres. You're the first person to play it and record it also. How does that look like?
Um, so it's a really interesting journey. Often you just get the piece and you receive the piece and you just start learning it at that point. And I might ask a composer if they're willing to change something. If I find, this is a new thing, by the way, I never used to do this, but I've realized that over the years that composers are not perfect and they sometimes don't have the necessary keyboard skills. They might have wonderful imaginations, but not necessarily have the inside knowledge of what it is to play the piano. So I will negotiate with them on things like that. And sometimes I commission the composers, which is an interesting pathway too, because sometimes I'll offer them some of my own money, and sometimes I'll apply for a grant. And sometimes they'll just want to write for me for nothing. So that depends on the composer and the circumstance. And when you commission a piece, you usually get first dibs on the recording as well. So you would get the right of refusal. You might, ask you might have a contract with the composer and say, in that contract, I'd like to have the option to record the piece first. And sometimes a recording will come out of it through the composer. The composer will have a recording going out of their disc and ask you to do it. Other times you will be making a record and say, would you mind if I record your piece? And they may have another agreement with somebody else that has already told them that they're going to record it. So you'll have to wait it out till that recording is out, or they'll say, well, let me check in with the other person. So it's a kind of little bit of a negotiation that has to take place there. Everybody knows that new music is not exactly a business. It's a kind of cause in a way, because the public still has a lot of difficulty with new music. And some composers, as we know, do very, very well, like Philip Glass and John Adams, and but others still rely on teaching. So it's difficult, it's a difficult journey. I don't think it's any more difficult than trying to make it in playing Beethoven, though, because we know that the opportunities there are very few and far between unless you hit the jackpot, like you win the Van Cliburn, or you're one of the 5 great pianists in the world. For most of us, we're not one of the 5 great pianists in the world, and we have to figure out a way to have a life in music. And so it's kind of choices. There are choices to be made, And I love doing new music because, as I said before, you are laying down the tradition yourself. You're deciding how that passage goes, and you know, whether the dynamics need to be exaggerated, whether the articulation doesn't work there, whether you can sometimes have negotiation with a composer before they've finished the piece. You know, they'll send you some pages, say, does this work? And then you say, oh yeah, that's really, really great, I love that. Or you can ask a composer to write you a specific piece. You can say, I need a piece that uses text. I use my voice a lot in pieces, and I have this text, and would you be willing to set this text? Would you write a song in there for me? Sometimes I do that. Will you do a piece for inside the piano? Would you not do a piece for inside the piano? Don't do any inside the piano. So, you know, that there are ways of going about this. Counting is a big thing. You need to be able to count for most new music, and I think that puts a lot of people off, you know. But one teacher that I had, the musicologist I mentioned, Richard Toop, he said, learn the pitches first, get a rough estimate of how fast it's got to go, and if it's even going to be possible, you know, because we know that some very complex music has been written by 20th century composers. So is that actually going to be possible for your hands, or is it going to be possible at all for anybody's hands? And then deal with the rhythms later. Deal with the rhythms on a tabletop, tapping them out, saying the rhythms. Work with the metronome a lot, and it'll all come together gradually. I think a lot of people are put off playing new music because they look and they see all complex rhythms. Or they look and they see that's really simple. That Philip Glass thing looks so easy. I don't want to play that. That's just really easy. In the class that I'm going to give, I'm going to go through works by Philip Glass, Frederic Rzewski, Martin Bresnik, and Julia Wolfe. And I might also do a little piece by Don Byron. In fact, I will do one by Don Byron to show that that even when some music is complex, some of the music that I'll be playing, but some of the music is more simplistic. There are complexities within that simplicity. There are many decisions to be made about color, about articulation, about speed that affect the entire aura that you're portraying.
Well, one more last question. What is American music to you?
American music is a lot of different things. American music, we think of, you know, Gershwin, right? Often when we think of American music, or Bernstein, or jazz, and the whole tradition of musicals. But American music is so rich and deep, and it has given the world so much. I mean, if you think of American music, the Aaron Copland coming up through all of the experimental composers of John Cage, Frederic Rzewski, Terry Riley, and then the minimalists, Philip Glass, Steve Reich, and then now today this incredible plethora of styles where anything goes, really. But I do think, when I think of American music, I think of rhythm and color and harmony and sort of accessibility. A lot of American music is very close to the heart. It's very visceral.